Okay, it's 10:01. Everybody, welcome to Adventures in American Judaism. I'm Zev Eleff. Terrific to study with you again and look at some of these materials. Our business today is to understand, borrowing from scholars of religion who look at how different religions, early Christianity and Judaism fundamentally, but how all faiths really grow out of one another, how they understand one another and make certain decisive decisions. There are certain tipping points uh, in which different groups have to go their separate ways. And so I want to look at this curious history with you. I see that most have muted themselves. Great. But certainly feel free to unmute if there are any questions. I'll see it in the chat box as well. But happy to engage. That's what's great about doing this live. So a brief timeline on our pivotal figure. There's Solomon Schechter in his workshop, in his study. In 1847, he was born to a Chabad family in Romania. By 1879, he's studied at the Berlin Hochschule for rabbinical ordination and graduate work. 1882, he moves to London to study and apprentice with Claude Montefiore, a major Judaica scholar at the time. 1890, Schechter is appointed a lecturer and reader at Cambridge University. 1896, he helps discover the archive, the Ben Ezra Synagogue, the so-called Cairo Geniza, and is pivotal in liquidating that repository, uh, the very dry air in Egypt, and the chumrah, the stringencies of the local community, and literally depositing anything and everything, it seems, in with Hebrew script. So it's not just copies of Torah scrolls and parchment and rabbinic writing, but there are contracts. There are letters. Anything with Hebrew seem to have gone into that attic section in the Cairo Geniza, and it really transformed the way that scholars understand medieval Jewish history. In 1902, after being courted for about a decade, he Schechter moves to New York to become president of the reorganized Jewish Theological Seminary, and he's there until he dies about a dozen years later, quite young. It's hard to really understate the importance of Solomon Schechter coming to the seminary in New York. He's actually brought I lead something called Gratz College in Philadelphia, wonderful institution. And we don't take enough credit. We brought Schechter in 1895 to speak after the endowment for Gratz College was set in motion. The leadership in Philadelphia brought Schechter to give a series of lectures, and they had very kindly offered to allow to ship him to New York to have conversations there. And that was the beginning in 1895 of his intensive courtship with the seminary. By 1902, the lay leadership of the seminary takes a big bet. There's a huge catalyst of cash that comes in. Earlier discussions about merging the Jewish Theological Seminary, founded in 1886, with Hebrew Union College, the flagship reform institution, have stalled and have been abandoned. And Schechter has come in to a reorganized Jewish Theological Seminary. The wooing and winning rates, Abraham Karp in his very important article, still the most important article about Schechter's arrival to the United States in 1963. The wooing and winning of Solomon Schechter has its fascination as a romance and importance as a pivotal incident in the cultural and religious history of the Jews in America, for it brought into play a variety of forces and factors which coalesced to shape the American Jewish community. I read that sentence a decade ago, and I thought it'd be really fun to write a monograph of key moments that emerge. Certainly, for example, the wiring of information about what was going on in Europe during Hitler Yamach Shemo's regime. Certainly, when Jews became aware truly what was happening. On the other side of the ledger, the appointment of Louis Brandeis certainly were these watershed or instantaneous moments that transformed American Jewish life. There are others, certainly as well. But that's one of that. Schechter is a pivot. It's hard to understand how important Solomon Schechter was. Um, he was the foremost scholar. There wasn't really a Jewish studies yet. The first chair in Jewish studies. Harvard and Columbia like to disagree about who made the first appointment. It's true that Harry Wolfson at Harvard was the first professor of Judaica, but the first chair, the Miller Chair, was endowed and offered to Salo Baron, I believe, in 1915. At any rate, Shuli Shorts, who's now the chancellor of the seminary, she has argued that the early 20th century, 1902, both in terms of the publication of the Jewish Encyclopedia, the uh, that's not the later encyclopedia in the 1970s, but the Jewish Encyclopedia, Encyclopedia Judaica, that is. Um, that attempt, along with the emergence of Schechter, was the real formative moment in the blossoming of academic Jewish studies. Cyrus Adler, who would be the successor to Schechter. Cyrus Adler, in reminiscing about the coming of Solomon Schechter, remarked, I believe that 8 cities claim the honor, see, Philadelphia is only one of them, of being the birthplace of Homer. I cannot recall how many people claim the honor of having been instrumental, that's Philadelphia as one of them, in bringing Dr. Schechter to the United States. Then it continues, using this language again. This is from Karp. The wooing and winning of Solomon Schechter by the American Jewish community was a drama of 12 years duration, with a cast of major and minor players. Dr. Solomon Solis Cohen intimating that Adler and Solis Cohen both Philadelphia Jewish elites. In the year 1890, I had the privilege of bearing a message from Sabbato Moraeus, who was the founder of the seminary in 1886. He would commute once a week from Philadelphia to New York. He was the rabbi or the reader, the chazan of Mikveh Israel, one of the oldest congregation, Spanish-Portuguese congregation in Philadelphia. That's where last week, that was the Adventures of Isaac Leeser in Philadelphia. Also, it's probably a sidebar. A number of congregations, communities claim to be have a share in being a first. So I mentioned last week that Shereth Israel in New York, that congregation doesn't really begin until 1729. They claim that the first 23 Jews who arrived here in 1650, were all 23 of them, maybe the exception of one or two, had actually left soon thereafter. Philadelphia Mikveh Israel claims the longest contiguous without break congregation. Shereth Israel had to disband services, or they elected to, rather than stay in Tory and British controlled New York during the Revolutionary War. Newport claims to have the oldest in use synagogue. That's a Touro synagogue, which is, I believe, leads Savannah, Georgia. There was a history of that community put out many decades ago, and I believe the title is called Third to None. No matter how you measure firsts, we come in high up, no matter what. So in the year 1890, I had the privilege of bearing a message from Sabbato Moraeus and his colleagues of the Jewish Theological Seminary, then recently established in New York, asking Schechter to consider the possibility of joining the teaching staff at the institution. Moraeus dies in 1897, and so for that 5-year period, that's the intensification of the courtship by the seminary of Solomon Schechter. Solomon Schechter is a profoundly important scholar, but he also becomes a Jewish religious leader. He supports a notion of Catholic Israel, Catholic meaning all-encompassing. Those who are entrusted with carrying out the purpose of this institution, this is what he delivers in his investiture at the seminary, which, as you have seen, aims at the perpetuation of the tenets of the Jewish religion. Both pupils and masters must faithfully and manfully maintain their loyalty to the Torah. There is no other Jewish religion but that taught by the Torah and confirmed by history and the tradition and sunk into the conscience of Catholic Israel. This is very much in contrast to Hebrew Union College, And the reform movement is sort of after Schechter. There's Emanuel Schreiber, a reform leader. Is Schechter Orthodox? There was no such thing. This supports what I said. Mike Cohn's theory that you don't have conservative Judaism until the 20th century. Before then, you may have people who approximate a certain spirit of conservative Judaism, but they don't call themselves conservative. They do. It's the lowercase c. It's traditionally conservative, religiously conservative. Schreiber launches, as does Kaufman Kohler, into a series of lectures. There's Solomon Schechter sitting down on the bench, questioning the bona fides of Schechter's orthodoxy. That happens in 1902, as soon as he arrives. It's clear that Schechter cannot be the leader of both Hebrew Union College and Jewish Theological Seminary. The attempts to merge the two have failed. HUC had gone through its own leadership crisis in 1900. Its longtime leader, its founder, Isaac Mayer Wise, we saw him last week. He passes away after a very long life. Rabbi Milzner, Moses Milzner is a fantastically interesting personality. He holds the fort. He holds down the fort for a couple of years until 1903. Kaufman Kohler, who is the erstwhile adversary of Wise. He's much more of a radical reformer. We'd seen him last week as well. He was the one who had moved Shabbat observance to Sunday in Chicago, who was preaching before empty pews. So the newspapers reported he leaves Chicago to New York, and now he is, in 1903, the leader of the seminary. And the fact that you have this polarizing figure at Hebrew Union College in Kohler, that creates that rivalry between the two. At this time, there is no such thing as Yeshiva University. That term would only come about until in 1945. It's known as RIETS, the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, or the Yeshiva. And it would not found Yeshiva College, the undergraduate program, until 1928. But it was a very, very small program in 1902. It was, to say it was a financially precarious institution is to put it lightly, about what today we call a Yeshiva University. At that time, there were these two dueling towers. There was the seminary and the college, Hebrew Union College. Because of that binary, the Agudas Harabanim, which were founded in 1902, shortly after the demise of the so-called chief rabbi of New York, Rabbi Jacob Joseph, they delivered a cherem against Schechter's seminary, as it was known. In a recent issue of the American Hebrew, that was an important traditional-leaning Jewish newspaper weekly in New York, we called attention to a resolution passed by a number of Orthodox rabbis, let's say Agudas Harabanim, or if in English, the Union of Orthodox Rabbis, or the Agudat Harabanim, but they pronounce it Agudas Harabanim, who have formed themselves into a union condemning any of their colleagues. This is different than the Agudas Yisrael, I should make clear. The biggest difference, not just in terms of their membership, was the Agudas Harabanim were Zionists, but they were born European trained rabbis who have formed themselves into a union condemning any of their colleagues preaching in English or countenancing the teaching of the Jewish religion in any other language but Yiddish. It is evident these rabbis do not consider this sufficient, for they have now gone a step further and have issued a circular, I don't think it's extant any longer, I've never seen it, in which they say the graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary who call themselves rabbis, as air quotes, have no right to act as rabbis and teachers according to the law of the scriptures and the Talmud, and warning any Orthodox congregation against appointing seminary graduates as their spiritual guides. One of the most prominent Orthodox congregations in the city recently appointed a former seminary student as its religious head, and all of the fury of these Orthodox rabbis has been directed against this synagogue and its leaders. So you have Agudas Harabanim, who would eventually become the sponsoring agency of the smicha of RIETS, who are taking umbrage of these American-trained rabbis of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Anybody know the first graduate of the seminary? It's a good trivia question. Any guesses?
Hertz.
Hertz, Rabbi Joseph Hertz, exactly right. Which again, nobody would question the orthodoxy of the chief rabbi of England. And it just added this complexity of the Jewish orientation of the seminary. So you have uh, you have the Agudas Harabanim who are taking issue with these American trained rabbis and their Americanized curriculum. It is certainly the curriculum does not look like Volozhin. It does not look like Telz or Slobodka. It's highly academic. They look at some of the teachers, most specifically, they look at Louis Ginsburg, who supports a level of biblical criticism. They're trying, just like the Reform, picking through all of the voluminous writings of Solomon Schechter to identify some sort of heresy of Schechter, and they are calling into question the veracity of the orthodoxy of any of their graduates. This is in 1904. That's published in June 1904. So within a year, in the Yiddish press, Schechter is quoted as saying, "It is not necessary to emphasize that this is an Orthodox seminary." His predecessor, Sabato Moraes, who is certainly Orthodox, although how to jibe that with the fact that he was cremated at the end of his life is unclear. But Moraes called the seminary enlightened orthodoxy. He was part of this Italian tradition, certainly not East. Nobody would have said it was Eastern European in orientation, but Schechter comes and he eschews, he uses terms, he uses a taxonomy like Catholic Israel. He's trying to what today we might call big tent Judaism. He didn't have such a lexicon at the time. So finally, push comes to shove. He says, it's not necessary to emphasize that this is an Orthodox seminary. It is a Jewish seminary. Of course it is Orthodox also. I never knew that I am Orthodox till I came to this country. We didn't use such terms in Europe, both on the continent and in England. In my father's home, we used to speak more of Judaism than of Orthodoxy. So he says, you know what? If you want me to call myself something, of course I'm Orthodox. But that's not a term that I've associated with. You have to forgive the cultural imbalance of growing up in Europe and now being in America. By 1913, in the final years of Schechter's life, a letter appears to the younger leadership, his students, Schechter's students, the young graduates of the seminary, from Henry Pereira Mendes, who, in addition to being the religious leader of the Spanish-Portuguese Synagogue in New York, Sheretz Israel, is one of the founders, if not the founder, of what today we call the Orthodox Union, the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America, and then later Canada. He writes the following. Dr. Schechter and Rabbi Cohn have both had several interviews with me concerning the proposed Agudath Yeshurun, or Agudas Yeshurun, or union for promoting traditional Judaism in America. Seems, I don't know an organization that has gone by that. I have carefully examined the preamble of the Constitution and the sketch of the Constitution sent to me. I understand that you are chairman of the Constitution Committee, and I therefore write to you. Mendes writes to the leadership of an organization that will eventually establish itself as the Rabbinical Assembly, the Rabbinical Guild, the Rabbinical Organization of what today we call conservative Judaism, as a counter group to both the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the rabbinical group of the Reform movement, and the Agudas Harabanim of the Orthodox. We'll get to a slide in a little bit. There was no Rabbinical Council of America, the RCA, yet. And so this congregational body, the OU, which is by then still, there was no institutional kashrus yet, a paper organization, is offering some sort of merger between the burgeoning rabbinic leadership of the seminary and the rabbis, the leaders, the lay leaders as well, of the Orthodox Union. Now, this is a collector's item. In order to explain my views to you, let us for a moment agree to the following definitions. This is Mendes on the right, even if they are not exactly correct. Even though it lacks precision, let's agree on a taxonomy of religious practice in American Judaism. First, there's something called Russian Orthodoxy. This is the orthodoxy which insists upon certain ritual and certain forms, but objects to English sermons, right? Yiddish only. This is the Goddess Rabbanim. Has little or no decorum, fails to hold its young men and young women, refuses in its schools Hebrew and religious education to girls, and cares little whether women and girls attend religious services or not. It also insists upon such customs as the Schechter, and in a word, degrades womanhood as you and I understand it. Second, this is an interesting term that doesn't emerge in full force until much, much later under a very different meaning. Modern Orthodoxy, as represented by, for example, your and my congregation, several Ashkenazic congregations, such as those in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Montreal. This orthodoxy resists innovations, such as an organ pews means mixed pews, disuse of a talit, female voices in the choir, and Christians in the choir, etc. Conservative Judaism, so it's bandied about at some level, but without much definition. Let this term mean the Judaism which permits some of the innovations named above. Fourth is the Reform Judaism, which, in addition to such innovations, rejects certain historical beliefs as and aspirations such as restoration, etc. And then he goes on to a radical Reform Judaism about Sunday services and the like. A little bit on this modern orthodoxy. In some ways, what we're looking at together is a history of labels. It's a history of names. I always try to make sure that our story leaves New York at some point. Maybe as a non-New Yorker, I feel obligated. I'm taking you to 1925 to Louis Epstein is about to become the rabbi. That is Louis Epstein, right? But this is the lay leader. They hadn't yet hired Epstein to report on a very important vote at Kilat Israel, known as KI. If you've driven in Brookline, in the main hub on Harvard Street, excuse me, you'll see this huge edifice that actually got bigger under Rabbi Hamilton, is KI. The problem of the seating arrangement. They don't make synagogue bulletins like they used to. This is Joseph Rudnick. He was the president at the time. The problem of the seating arrangement at our temple was thoroughly debated at the meeting of February 25th, 1925, and fought out with an Australian ballot, secret ballot, in accordance with a petition signed by 7 members of good standing who demanded that such a vote be taken. The result of the vote is known to all. At first, we'll find out what the vote came to in a second. At first, when this question came up before the board meeting and members at large, I expressed my opinion and hoped that Kilat Israel KI would remain in every way an Orthodox congregation. And I had hoped that we would have a sufficient number of Jews in Brookline, right, the first suburb outside of Boston, of the type that would support a strictly Orthodox synagogue. There were, however, an overwhelming majority of people who had given money toward the erection of the temple and who felt that this congregation should be what is called a, not strict Orthodox, modern Orthodox congregation. So number one, Rudnick has identified the difference between a strict Orthodox and a modern Orthodox, as his formulation has it, is that a modern Orthodox has mixed seating and a traditional prayer book. And a strict Orthodox has the traditional prayer book and separate seating. More on this modern Orthodox thing. Writes Solomon Zukro, who was a very important scholar, teacher at Hebrew College at that time in Boston, writing in 1928 at the same moment, I am convinced that the future of Judaism lies in the hands of the modern, this is my bold, modern Orthodox rabbi. He is the only man who can once again make our religion a law of life, possessing a secular as well as rabbinic education. He can appeal to both the old and the new generations, somebody who writes English well. He's particularly interested in the Aguna crisis. We'll get to that in a little bit. An unknown rabbi publishing an advertisement in the American Hebrew, prominent rabbi, thinks of himself as prominent, forceful orator, successful organizer, well-known scholar, 43 years old, at present in charge of a large congregation in the South, would consider change of pulpit. Only conservative or modern Orthodox congregation desired. To be in touch with this rabbi, I had no idea if he got a new job or not. Contact the American Hebrew newspaper in New York. Finally, on this issue of modern orthodoxy, staying exactly in the same second half of the 1920s, Sam Czar, who was the registrar, but really the leader, the placement officer for RIETS, the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, he is responding to an inquiry to send a rabbi or rabbinic candidate to Omaha, Nebraska, writes Sam Czar back to the Jews of Omaha. Please advise by wire what you mean by modern Orthodox congregation. We don't have the letter to him, but they obviously call themselves a modern Orthodox congregation. Our graduates, referring to RIETS, while American-born modern in the fullest sense of the word, are, however, strictly Orthodox. I don't know if I guess these terms were very much in the air. Do you intend to have family pews in your synagogue? So let me stop for a moment. Any questions on this? I see there are some questions in the chat. So I have a couple questions, then we'll get to everybody in the boxes. One question is, what about the Spanish-Portuguese congregations? Certainly, as is today, Sephardic, and I say that with a lowercase s, Sephardic communities get to leverage, I think, a certain worldliness to it. It's only now, particularly in Los Angeles and maybe in Israel, that Idut HaMizrach congregations are having to align themselves with the I'll call it denominationalism, although I take issue with that term. But for Sephardim to identify as Orthodox, conservative, and Reform, it's very rare, to my understanding. They can avoid such nomenclature, which boxes them in. Right. England is very, very different. And English rabbi, question was about the comparison between America and England. Certainly the religious proclivities of both are very different. I wrote an article a long time ago on the reception of Samson Raphael Hirsch in America and in England, much more better received in England than the United States. There's a certain Eastern European feel to America, to American Orthodoxy. If you think about the coin of the realm being Talmud, right? Orthodox Jews, I mean, the assumption everybody here is certainly not, but the Orthodox Jewish community has privileged Talmud learning, very Eastern European learning, whereas in England, certainly that's the case in many enclaves in England, but there is a certain embrace of theology and more of a Tanakh. Maybe it's the proximity to Israel, maybe it's the German Orthodoxy, which cultivated it. England in long before there ever was really an orthodoxy in the United States, or certainly an entrenched orthodoxy in the United States. But you look no further than the chief rabbis, that Rabbi Sachs and Rabbi Jacobovitz and others, but just to highlight the two of them, known very much as ethicists, and philosophers and sermonizers, and take no issue with them whatsoever. Not necessarily your traditional Rosh Hashiva that you would find in American enclaves. Last question, then I'll open it up for everybody here. When did what they call modern Orthodox become conservative? Well, we'll get there. I promise. Happy to go back to the slides, but I wanted to give space in case anybody wanted to ask a question or to comment.
Could I say something? Because I'm English, currently in Jerusalem.
Good, a rebuttal. Yeah.
No, it's not a rebuttal. You're right. It's very interesting to hear Americans talk about the English. Actually, we were much more ignorant than the Americans. So I've got two questions. There was Herbert Goldstein, the grandfather of my great friend, the wife of the chief rabbi of Haifa, because she always said, and she's biased, of course, that her grandfather was the one who brought in the English setup to the USA Orthodoxy. But in England, what happened was there was a split, and what was created was the Federation, which was the East European. The British were East European. The chief rabbis were not regarded as very good, the ones that Queen Victoria chose, the Adlers. Rabbi Hertz was good simply because he supported Zionism when it was very important. But I'm afraid that his commentaries, there's somebody else who gave a talk on this, I think, before you, and he agreed with me, were very much looked down on because they talked about the critical theories. So what happened was there's a town near Newcastle called Gateshead on the border with Scotland, and all the really frummy types that you're implying were there in Gateshead because the chief rabbinate was really there to promote being Anglo-Jewish, which, well, it's not really worked, has it? And the people that want a more yeshiva education, now making aliyah. So it's very interesting that we never felt, Lord Jakobovits, I'm old enough to remember him, was a great chief rabbi who supported us whenever there was anti-Semitism. And I'm sure Hertz was the same, but none of the others, I don't want to mention names, were any good other than sort of as light thinkers or, But America, don't knock it. America's had some marvelous thinkers, and I'm just wondering whether you're going to bring up Rabbi Goldstein, if you know who I
Herbert
mean.
Goldstein is the leader of the Orthodox Union, and he's not going to appear in a slide, but certainly I'm deeply familiar with Herbert S. Goldstein, and I'll try to weave him in as much as I can the next half hour. I'm not a political scientist, so I can't weigh in, Irene, on the the efficacies of the chief rabbinate. Others have written about it. Certainly, as remember, in America, you have a separation of church and state. You have no such thing as state-sponsored religion. Quite the contrary. In England, I will say that the success of the chief rabbinate is the humility to partner with the Dayanim, both in Gateshead and Golders Green and other places, and that shared leadership, rabbinic leadership, has gone a long way. And I think American rabbinate, Orthodox rabbinate, can stand to learn a thing about synergies. Let me jump back in, move the controls for Zoom so I can read a little bit better. In the late 1920s, the head of the Rabbinical Assembly, eventually the chancellor, he was the first chancellor rather than president of the seminary, is Rabbi Louis Finkelstein, and he delivers a speech. This is the printed version of it, The Things That Unite Us. Deeply worried that the conservative movement, here you have Mordechai Kaplan in the middle, that the conservative movement had its vital center, to use an Arthur Schlesinger term, had a vital center that was flanked by its left and by its religious right, is what made the conservative movement successful, particularly in the post-World War II period, as in the move to the suburbs. You had rabbis who would have graduated from REITs, but they wanted a job, frankly. And they knew that they could get one by switching to the seminary. My teacher, Jeffrey Gurak, wrote an article in volume up there, in case you thought this was a Zoom screen, in Tradition Renewed, fabulous 2 volumes set on the centenary of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And Jeff's article was about yeshiva students, yeshiva college students, becoming feeder for the seminary, which is quite interesting. Finkelstein, in his remarks, though, in the 1920s, acknowledges that there's a vital center, and there are those to the right of him who would be otherwise Orthodox, would be uncomfortable in praying or leading a congregation with mixed seating. And there are those on the left, signaled by Mordechai Kaplan, who people are, even in the vital center, deeply uncomfortable with. Eugene Cohn, who was referred to in that earlier letter from 1913, talking about this lexicon, these terms. Well, let's get even more splintering here. The very names by which so-called conservative Jews sometimes designate their allegiance are significant of the absence of a strongly felt affirmative principle. They speak. So this is criticizing Finkelstein. Finkelstein. They speak of their congregations as being semi-reformed or modern Orthodox, permitting their attitude to reform and orthodoxy to constitute the sole definition of their own purpose. If the Pew study, for example, which had its initial study of American Jews in 2013 and did a follow-up study in 2020, the way that the script worked, maybe some of you were asked to participate in the survey, if you would have, the question that would be asked, which movement do you align with, Orthodoxy, Reform, Reconstructionist, Conservative, and you answered Orthodox. There's a follow-up prompt that the interviewer would to ask you, which type of Orthodoxy do you identify with? Hasidic, Yeshivish, Modern Orthodoxy, there were a few others. It got a little bit different in the 2020 study. But if that Pew convention would have been deployed in the 1930s, 1940s, presumably you would have been asked, are you Orthodox, Reform, or Conservative? There wasn't Reconstructionist yet. And you were to answer conservative, it would ask, are you semi-reform conservative, modern Orthodox conservative? The same way that in the 19th century, you would have said you're reform. Well, are you moderate reform or radical? It's real. The subdivisions of religious movements are really, really interesting and are keyed in at particular moments. This is the moment for conservative Judaism. So I see that there are some Jewish Center stalwarts here with us today. So you'll be happy to see Leo Young. Guess I didn't have Herbert Goldstein. I had a different West Sider. Dear colleagues, the first national convention of the recognized, let me see if I can make it a bit bigger. Oh, there we go. The Rabbinical Council of the UOJC, the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations, of the Rabbinical Association of the Yeshiva, and the Rabbinical Association of the Yeshiva will take place, please God, July 1st and 2nd, at Belmar, New Jersey, at the Hotel Carlton, 9th Street and Ocean Avenue. And out of the Orthodox Union then would come what today we call the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America, in 1935. It would eventually leave. Vic Geller has it in his memoir about the very complicated separation, still not fully separated, between the OU and the RCA today. It had to do with who would get kashrus. I think the RCA regrets how that ended up. And in the early 1940s, the RCA folds in the rabbinical alumni of the Hebrew Theological College, where I worked for some 8 years. I know there's some people here who graduated. It's quite wonderful. The rabbinical alumni of what eventually, in a few years, will be called Yeshiva University, and what now is today colloquially known as Skokie Yeshiva, Hebrew Theological College, together with the earlier support of the Orthodox Union, that's the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations, for the terms, they formed the Rabbinical Council of America, which is a huge step in forming an orthodoxy or a modern orthodoxy out of this group, because now it's not just that you have this European trade of Goodness and the Rabbinical Assembly, but now they're the what we today call YU, and its Midwestern or Western counterpart, the Yeshiva, there's the Yeshiva and the Yeshiva, coalesced to form the Rabbinical Council of America. Thank you. Professor Kaplan's here to give thank you for covering that, who's in the picture. I talked about the vital center on the left and to the right. Well, the Agudas Rabbanim takes a huge shot at this now slowly separating conservative movement in 1945 by trying to take out and burning in effigy the prayer book of Mordechai Kaplan. He has already produced a Haggadah, which has blurred notions of chosenness, Am HaNivchar, as well as some others. There's a text of the ban, which is published in Hapardes, of the probably most important rabbinical journal in the United States at the time, Asifat HaCherem, the gathering to excommunicate Kaplan, and blaming the conservative movement for continuing to incorporate Kaplan, who would eventually himself leave to form Reconstructionist Judaism. Part of the challenges of the conservative movement in the last 40 or 50 years is about the departure of the left and the right flank. When UTJ with Halivni left from the right and Kaplan had earlier left from the left, in order to be a vital center, you need to have a left and the right. It wasn't the Kaplan prayer book, but the Silberman prayer book that was established around the same time. Here is the forward and the introduction, acknowledging the need for a movement to have a prayer book for Sabbath and festivals. If you need a new prayer book at some level, you are gesturing to the need to call yourself something different and to concretize your movement. And that's what we're seeing in the 1940s. But not it's not so definitive. So, for example, in Atlanta, Georgia, you have a declaration, a partnership between Rabbi Tobias Geffen and Rabbi Harry Epstein, coming out in favor of Shabbos here in Atlanta, Georgia. I guess I'll stop for a second. Rabbi Tobias Geffen is most famous for
Coca-Cola.
Coca-Cola. But does anybody know how that happened? Why he's only partially to credit? Who else is to be credited? Little Miss Geffen. What do I mean by that? There's a really a fabulous article in the Festschrift honoring Rabbi Haskell Lookstein by Rabbi Dr. Adam Mintz, in which he points out that the history is really interesting. Little Miss Geffen was going to be valedictorian of her public school, high school class, and she was a whiz in trigonometry and calculus. Well, there was a Jewish vice president of Coca-Cola whose daughter, let's say, was not a whiz at trigonometry. Maybe it was algebra 2. And so little Miss Geffen tutored the daughter of the vice president of the Coca-Cola company. And I showed you that journal, Pardes, well, Rabbi Shmuel Pardes, he named it after himself. He told everybody that Coca-Cola was kosher. Rabbi Geffen dutifully said, no, it's not. Nobody knows the secret formula. And he gained access, not just because he was known in his time as the Ramosha Feinstein of the South. Maybe it was after his time that he was known as such. Either way, he only gained access to the secret formula because his daughter tutored the daughter of the vice president of Coca-Cola. It's important when we can acknowledge the role of women in shaping our not just our religious affinities. And she was also helpful when Pardes was at it again and said, it's kosher l'Pesach. I said, no, it's not. It's kidney out. And so Rabbi Geffen had to dig up the secret formula again. If you're interested in competing with Coca-Cola, you need only go to the Center for Jewish History and look at the earlier manuscripts of Lev Tuvia that are held in his archive in the papers of Rabbi Tobias Geffen. Because in Lev Tuvia, in the final tshuva, you see that the tshuva for Coca-Cola, he replaces certain items with symbols to protect the integrity of the secret formula. But I'm told that if you look at the earlier incarnations of that sefer, that book of responsa, you'll find the actual secret formula circa 1936. So in case you were looking to disrupt the soft drink company. So we'll go back. Rabbi Harry Epstein, in his own right, is very interesting. He's somebody who was trained in Chicago at HTC, Hebrew Theological College, whose father was a major European-trained, European-born figure, Rabbi Ephraim Epstein, on the Rishon Shul on the west side of Chicago. He eventually leaves to become a conservative rabbi. He also studied in Hebron, and his brother was actually killed in the Hebron massacre. Actually, excuse me, Rabbi Epstein didn't study in Hebron. He studied in Slobodka, which became Hebron. for those keeping score. These are a little bit too small. It's always interesting to see where you can grab materials. What am I providing for you? I'm providing for you the yearbook of Torah Vodaas, 1955. And I provided two different op-eds, one by the editor, David Horowitz, the propagation of our eternal light, an attack on the eternal light series of films and radio production by the Jewish Theological Seminary. Now we're in the post-war period, who is very much, if you take a look, what do I want to read to you? It's full of amazing material. The basic reason for the degradation, this is a high school kid, lies in the fact that American Jews have not fully awakened to the necessity of educating their youth in the path of Torah. They have foolishly believed that the observance of Shabbos and Kashrus labels them a Jew. They are content with their children growing up as they did and do not encourage them to forge ahead in spiritual values. Naturally, we cannot minimize nor detract from the credit due these observers, but certainly Judaism comes to a much broader scope. What do I want to show you? Even before then, but even in America, I'm in the third paragraph. Even in America, Jews have and still are spreading out in remote cities. This is the GI Bill. People are buying homes in the suburbs and villages, thereby losing contact with the core of Jewish life, which has been established in New York. In these small towns, they are at present falling prey to the rapidly gaining conservative movement, so it's becoming a full-fledged movement now, and are forgetting the principles and ethics for which their parents and grandparents forfeited their lives a mere decade ago. This modified form of Judaism is advocated by a group of people who are ashamed to tell and show the world that they are Jews and who bury their heads in sands of assimilation. Well, also graduating from that class would become the Rosh Hashiva of Torah Vodaas, Rabbi Yisrael Belsky. Hey. Take a look at what he writes. In our generation, we have seen the knowledge of man advance to great strides. Just move these controls. What am I? And you see how terribly worried he is. In our generation, we've seen knowledge of man advance in great strides. The standards of our imagination have in turn risen by the same proportions. No longer do we limit our futures by the limit of our conceptions. The intellectuals among us have already begun to fancy their own brains as the fountain of wisdom, and so we dream of new conquests and new frontiers to overcome. We think that new progress will obviate war and bring peace to the world, yet our dreams of conquest grow higher with our material and intellectual progress. He is criticizing this blending of not just a conservative Judaism, but anything that is part of
Harrison. Harrison.
I mean, everybody can mute. If you can mute. Let me just.
Yeah. It's not that clear.
There we go. Sorry about that. Oh. This is well-tried material, but still important context at the same time. 11 Rosh Yeshiva, notably not Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, the leading rabbinic figure at what is now known by then Yeshiva University, sign up Psak Din, we have here Professor Kaplan, who's written an important article on Das Torah, which is important, it doesn't use the term, certainly of that kind, that prohibits Orthodox institutions from joining into intra-denominational Jewish groups such as the Synagogue Council of America and the New York Board of Rabbis. There is an attempt to get the RCA to join in this effort. Chicago, CRC, the Chicago Rabbinical Council, eschews and demurs against Rabbi David Hollander's attempt to bring this tshuva to what by then is now being called the modern Orthodox movement. But there is that attempt to separate Orthodoxy and conservative Judaism irrevocably. I always like to look at this set of sources when in the final evaluation is sort of this end moment. By the end of the 1950s, Rabbi Hillel Kavor of Denver, Colorado, who is a Schechter man through and through, was one of the earlier graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary under Schechter's leadership. He would have been called the right flank of the conservative movement. He is now a retired rabbi at the traditional, actually became literally for a different conversation, traditional synagogue in Denver, Colorado. He writes to the head of the Rabbinical Assembly in 1958 to Aaron Blumenthal. Dear Rabbi Blumenthal, after long consideration, I have reached the decision regretfully to tender herewith my resignation from the Rabbinical Assembly of America for the following reasons. Having been one of the organizers of the Rabbinical Assembly, I know that it was the intention of the founders that the Rabbinical Assembly be an instrument to cherish and promote traditional Judaism in an ideal American setting without deviating in any way from Torah true Judaism. It's a language from Rabbi Samson Val Hirsch, Torah Troya, Torah true. Unfortunately, in the past 15 or 20 years, the leaders of the Rabbinical Assembly have chosen to introduce a new philosophy of Judaism. It's not clear what he's talking about. He's talking about the Tshuva 1950, the responsa to permit driving to shul on Shabbat, as you're referring to the Lieberman clause, which allows for a conservative Beit Din to eradicate a marriage to prevent an aguna, recalcitrant situation, and have condoned changes, innovations, and interpretations, which in my judgment are contrary to the spirit of the letter of the Torah. Spirit and letter, it's always ironic that people who use it don't realize they're quoting from Paul, and which are not consistent with the principles upon which the Jewish Theological Seminary, the Rabbinical Assembly, and the United Synagogue, that would be the seminary, be the rabbinical institution, the Rabbinical Seminary, Rabbinical Assembly being the rabbinical group, and the United Synagogue being the congregational group. The protests of these members of the Rabbinical Assembly, who have remained true to the original pattern, have been ignored and at times even ridiculed. For these reasons, I find that I can no longer remain a member of the rabbinical organization, which has rejected many of the religious principles and precepts upon which I have based my personal life and my ministry as a rabbi. I therefore wish to sever my affiliation with the Rabbinical Assembly of America, effective immediately. I trust that you will read my letter in its entirety to the membership committee. Wishing you a happy Pesach. I am very truly yours, Rabbi C.E. Hillel Kavor, Denver, Colorado. Now, apparently, Rabbi Kavor also sent a copy to the Orthodox Union, which Rabbi Samson Weiss, who was the staff leader there, dear Rabbi Kavor. So the first letter appeared in March 1958. This letter comes before that. I did it out of order. But it's important to end this. The undersigned had the pleasure of meeting you several years ago. I spoke at the annual dinner of the Denver Hebrew Day School and also met you at several occasions in the East, among them at the 1954 convention of the Union Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America. That was an important one because that was the announcement of a new institution called NCSY. After this introduction, may I come to the point of this letter. I would like to express to you on behalf of the Union our feelings of deep gratification that your long struggle for Torah true Judaism in your congregation and community is bearing such beautiful fruits. You've quietly fought a tremendous battle against odds which would have made any lesser man give up long ago. We know that the present developments and the ever more pronounced return to traditional Judaism of your congregation must give you a deep sense of satisfaction. We also know that you seek neither reward nor recognition, but that you are only concerned with the accomplishment itself. That makes all of us who know of this accomplishment admire you even more. You will, I hope, forgive me, a younger man, this offer of earnest appreciation. I write as I do, not for the purpose of tendering you praise which you abhor, but solely to fulfill a deep inner urge and obligation which seeks expression. With all good wishes, I am respectfully yours, Dr. Sampson R. Weiss, Executive President of the Orthodox Union. So by the outset or by the end of the 1950s, we're seeing this long, multi-decade emancipation from one another. It wasn't that conservative moved away from orthodoxy or orthodoxy moved away from conservative Judaism. The two groups looking at different structures, different variables, different forces, whether it be rabbinical authority, whether it be interpretations of halakha, whether it represents, are we allowed to intermingle? Are we able to cooperate through all the myriad factors at play? Forced both movements to go in very different directions until it was impossible to say that they were anything close, that you could use this term of modern orthodoxy as a bridge term for the both of them. By the immediate post-war period, it was very clear that Catholic Israel of Solomon Schechter, this idea of a big tent traditional Judaism, could no longer function in the United States. And instead, you had two full-fledged groups, one which, after 60 years, could finally call itself a conservative Judaism. You had an Orthodox Judaism of many different types, trying to understand what it was, but what they all knew is that they weren't conservative Jews any longer. All right, everybody. We have a few minutes. Happy to take questions. If not, I'll see you at the same bad time, same bad channel. You have to unmute if you have a question. Oh, I do see there are comments in the chat box. All right, everybody. All right, have a wonderful week. Bye.
Thank you.